Hey everybody. So I'm going to actually divide this lesson into two videos. So this first video will talk about the first three of seven narrative elements, and the second video will talk about the last four. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because I want to be able to spend more time on the top three elements because I believe that they are the most important and they're the ones that I'm specifically looking to see on your major essay. So make sure you pay attention. The second video, those elements are also important, and it would be a good idea to sprinkle those throughout your paper to give it a bit more pizzazz, but they are not required so much as these are. So here we go. And you might want to open up your narrative writing Google Slides so that you can follow along. So here we go. So first things first, there's some videos here that you can watch that give you some good sense of what narrative writing is all about and how to do it well. Kurt Vonnegut is an excellent writer and gives you some great advice. And then, of course, Stephen King, the master of horror himself. And since this is a horror essay, be a good idea to pay attention to what he has to say. So, anyway, and we'll talk more about this show don't tell later. Okay, so here are your seven elements. You have plot, character, setting, point of view, theme, symbolism, and then language, tone, and style are lumped together because they are inseparable from one another. So all in all, here are your seven elements. We're going to talk about plot, character, and setting in this video. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about point of view, theme, symbolism, and then language, tone, and style. Okay, so what is plot? Well, you all know what plot is. Plot is the actual story. It's the events of the story. Plot drives the story forward, but what drives plot? Well, suspense drives plot, because plot is actually a combination of cause and effect relationships. This happens, which causes this to happen, which causes this to happen, and it has a chain effect. Let me give you an example. So if I were to say the king died and then the queen died, well, those are just events. But if I said the king died and then the queen died from a broken heart, well, now you have cause and effect relationship. See, in my first example, the king died, then the queen died. Those are just events that happen. They may be related, they may not be related. But if the king dies and then the queen, in her grief, takes her own life or dies from a broken heart, well, now you have a cause and effect relationship that is dependent on the previous event to make it happen. Think about movies that you watch or scary stories that you watch. Characters are searching through a house, and all of a sudden they hear a spooky noise in the attic or in the basement. Well, being the geniuses that they are, they go and investigate. Why do they go and investigate? Because they heard a spooky noise. And because they go and investigate, they bump into a cat or a bird or whatever it is that caused the original sound. And because that spooks them into retreating backwards, well, what do they bump into? They bump into the killer or the monster or the creature, whatever it is. All of those events happened because of the event that happened before it. So, plot is broken up into pieces or parts, if you will. And relatively speaking, now every story is slightly different. Some stories may have all of these, some stories may have multiple of these, some stories may be missing some of these. It just depends. But if you've ever seen a plot tree where you have like a line and then you have a hill and then you have like a point at the top of the hill and then another like downward slope and then another line, that little carrot looking device, that's your typical plot structure. And it starts with exposition. Exposition is your background information. What do we need to know about the characters? What do we need to know about what's going on in their world, the conflict that's happening? If we're talking about Marvel's Infinity War, exposition would be background information. What do we need to know about Thanos? What do we need to know about his mission, his purpose? What do we need to know about his army, the impending threat? Rising action would be his army coming to Earth, creating conflict, searching for the Infinity Stones. His minions fighting the various Avengers and trying to take the stones from them. Then the climax is the point in the story when the protagonist, who's your main character, and the antagonist, who is not necessarily the bad guy, because, hey, sometimes the main character is a bad guy. Think about Infinity War. The main character of that story is actually Thanos. He's a bad guy. So he would be the protagonist. The people or person who is directly in contrast or in conflict with the protagonist, they are the antagonist. And in the case of Infinity War, that would be the Avengers. So the climax of a story is when the protagonist and the antagonist can no longer advance in their mission, their individual missions, without confronting one another. And the climax is that point of direct confrontation. Well, the following action is once that confrontation has happened, now what? Thanos beats the snot out of the Avengers, and they are defeated. He gets all the stones. The following action is now that he has all the stones and he snaps his fingers, people start to die because of the climax. And then the resolution is, now that half the universe is dead, what do they do about it? Now, in the case of Marvel's Infinity War, the resolution isn't there. It kind of cuts to black to leave it open for a sequel. The resolution starts up in Endgame. So, plot is very important. The second element is character. So if plot drives the story, what drives the plot? What creates the those elements, those things that happen in the story? The suspense, the conflict. Well, that would be characters. So as far as a story goes, a plot is what happens, but characters make you care about what happens. The more developed you can make a character, the more people are going to care about what happens to them. Think about movies that you've seen or stories that you've read where the character is really well developed. You genuinely care about their safety and well-being. Marvel's Infinity War benefits from the fact that they had, I don't know, over a dozen, 18 movies or something, movies of character development. So by the time we get to Infinity War, you genuinely care about the various Avengers, and you even probably have a favorite. Personally, I'm a fan of Captain America. So I genuinely was worried about him, especially when he was going up against Thanos by himself. I was like, oh, Cap, don't do that. That's not going to end well for you, buddy. But why did I care? Because he had been so well developed in previous movies. Well, short stories don't have that much space to develop their characters, but they can still develop their characters in a number of ways. And they can do that by doing things like describing what they physically look like, giving them some physical characteristics that are unique. Maybe they have buck teeth, maybe they have a lisp, maybe they have really shaggy hair. I mean, think about Harry Potter. He's described as having like a mop on top of his head and a thunderbolt scar on his forehead and big, thick rimmed glasses. Okay, Hermione is described as having this big, bushy brown hair, I think, and Ron Weasley, that big head of red hair, right? Their names can be important. Sometimes names can be ironic. If you've ever read Of Mice and Men, there's a character there named Lenny Smalls, who is a giant of a man. That's pretty ironic. Sometimes their actions, maybe they have a limp, maybe they constantly click their tongue, maybe they have a nervous tic or something like that. Their attitude, maybe they're super cocky, maybe they're super arrogant, maybe they're really mischievous. Look at Loki. He's one of many people's favorite characters from Marvel. Even though he started out as a villain, he became kind of an anti-hero because of his attitude. He had just this kind of like, he had this cocky attitude, but he also had this kind of playful nature about him, mischievous. And then dialogue. Think about the way Thor talks and how much different that is from the way that Tony Stark talks. You know, Thor has this very old, like Norse, thou shalt, and stuff like that. And Tony is very hip to modern trends. You know, he calls the villain Squidward and Grimace. Okay, so what types of characters are there? Protagonists and antagonists. We've already talked about those. The protagonist is your main character. Whether they're a good guy or bad guy, doesn't matter. If they're the main character, they're the protagonist. Then you have the antagonist. The person, whether they're a good guy or bad guy, doesn't matter. They are the person in direct conflict with the protagonist. Then you have round and flat characters. A round character is a well-developed character who has many of these physical features or names, actions, attitudes, dialogue, things like that, things that make them well-developed. A flat character is a character who's just in the story to move the story along. If you were to look at Lord of the Rings, you would look at characters like Frodo and Sam, and you would say that they are very round characters because they are very well developed. But then you might look at somebody like Gollum, who, at least in the movie, was not very well developed. He was more kind of a flat character, if you will. Then you have anti-heroes. These are heroes that are going to save the day, but they're going to do so in their own way. Maybe they'll break a few laws in the process. Who knows? Batman, the Punisher, these would be examples of anti-heroes. Batman's going to save the day, but he's going to break a bunch of bones in the process, and he's going to assault a bunch of people and put them in the hospital. That's not legal, and that's not what a good guy would do, but that's Batman's thing. And then, most importantly, besides protagonist and antagonist, most importantly, you have what is known as a foil. A foil is a character who only exists in the story to bring out certain elements of the protagonist or antagonist. So, for example, if you were to look at a Christmas Carol, you know, Ebenezer Scrooge, Bob Cratchit, the Ghosts of Christmas Past, Christmas Present, Christmas Future, if you're familiar with that story. In that story, Ebenezer Scrooge is the main character. He's the protagonist. And in that story, he is totally mean. He's a bully to his employee, Bob Cratchit. Bob Cratchit only exists in that story to make Ebenezer Scrooge seem that much more mean and heartless, so that by the time the story reaches its conclusion and Ebenezer has a change of heart, the way that he goes out of his way to help Bob Cratchit demonstrates to the audience just how much he's changed. Bob Cratchit only exists in that story as a foil to make Ebenezer seem horrible at first and to demonstrate how much he's changed by the end of it. And then last but not least, you have settings. Now, setting, of course, is where the story takes place. But it's more than that. A setting could have implications beyond just where it takes place. It could have political ramifications. It could have historical ramifications. It could have societal ramifications. Think about this. If I said the story took place in an attic, okay, yeah, it takes place in an attic. That's the setting. Okay, fair enough. Maybe you feel a certain sort of way about that. Maybe you don't, but it really doesn't give us much. But if I said that the story took place in an attic at the height of World War II in Nazi Germany, in the house of a Jewish sympathizer, well, now we've got a bunch of ramifications that completely change the setting and make it so much more important. Another thing that's important for making settings work and come alive is using your five senses. Put yourself in the mind of your characters. What do they see? What do they hear? What are they touching? What are they smelling? Sight, smell, touch, taste. What are they tasting? What are they hearing? Fill up the five senses. If I say the story took place in a stadium, baseball stadium, okay, fair enough. It's a setting in a baseball stadium. Okay, big deal, right? But if I start to describe the smell of the popcorn, the crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd, the stickiness of the railing, the gumminess of the seats, the putrid stench of body odor of the people next to me. Well, now I've got a really robust setting that really kind of makes you feel like you're there. So when you're creating your setting, try to fill it with your five senses. Create that atmosphere. If you're talking about a happy story, create an atmosphere that creates a tone of happiness. If you're talking about a scary story, hint, 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 create an atmosphere with your five senses that creates something spooky or scary to make the reader dread what happens next. And that's it for this video. I will continue on with my next video after this.